In this video, I want to talk about the power of hypnotherapy, how it can help you, and even talk about a case study. Let's get into it. Hello, my name is James Taylor. I'm an online counsellor, hypnotherapist, life coach. I'm also an author, a podcaster, and a YouTuber. So, the power of hypnotherapy. It's not like what you see in the films. No one is dancing like a duck. No one is thinking they're Elvis or Tina Turner. You're not revealing your deepest, darkest secrets, and you're not giving your PIN number to someone else so they can clear out your bank account. All that is Hollywood. Now, it makes for a funny, interesting film. It just happens not to be true at all. So please dismiss that idea. Another thing that sometimes crops up, and it's a phrase that I really don't like, it's putting someone under. I was put under hypnotherapy. Well, that's not true either, because that implies that someone has control over another person, and that just isn't the case. So that's another thing you can hopefully put in the bin, that it isn't really real. Hypnotherapy is actually far cooler than that. Now, some of the things that hypnotherapy can do. Before we get into that, let's talk about what hypnotherapy is. Hypnotherapy is a very, very natural state that you probably find yourself dropping in and out of multiple times throughout the day without realizing you're doing it. So you're actually putting yourself in trance multiple times throughout the day. So what kind of thing am I talking about? So let's say you're reading a book or a book, depending on where you're from, and you're reading the book and your mind wanders off, but your eyes keep on going down the page. Well, you've mentally gone somewhere else. And then you might find yourself bringing yourself back to the book and you think, oh, I can't remember the last few bits I read. And you have to go back into the conscious part and carry on from the story. Or let's say you are on a train and you might look out the window of a train and you're not really looking at what's outside the window. As you're doing it, your mind wanders off. Daydreaming, all that kind of stuff. That's a form of trance. Now, how hypnotherapy can help you in particular is, let's say that you suffer from stress or anxiety. Okay. Now, I want you to think of it this way. Imagine a path through a forest. Okay. And everyone walks that path. So the path is very, very well trodden and it's clear to see. That's a bit like a neural pathway. And what I mean by that is, you think of a certain thing and your brain follows the path to its conclusion. Now, if that path leads to anxiety, I would say it's not a very good path, but it might be well trodden. So that's the one you go on the majority of the time. When something happens, you automatically go for that path. Hypnotherapy, what it does is it lets you explore what other paths are there, so I don't result in anxiety. Does that make sense? So when you explore other paths, you can maybe circle around and miss this path entirely. But of course, this is a new path. This one is well trodden over here. This new one, maybe it's not even a path at all. Maybe you've got to create the path. But what happens is, with hypnotherapy, when you start doing this at an unconscious level, you start to internally and unconsciously create this new path going off to the side. And when that happens, this new path starts to become well trodden. And the previous path that was leading to anxiety starts to overgrow and eventually doesn't become a path at all. It's a path that, you know, there was a path there once, but it's a path that you no longer take. Does that make sense? So this is the power of hypnotherapy, because this well-trodden path, I would say the majority of people stay on that well-trodden path when there are other options open to you. And hypnotherapy can help you find those other options. So it's great for stress, anxiety, fears, all this kind of stuff. A really good one it's for is phobias. Now, phobias, you might have a phobia yourself, and maybe it's mild, maybe it's very, very severe. A phobia is different from a fear. A fear of clowns, for instance, is not a phobia of clowns. A phobia is something that is more intense, more impactful on you in a detrimental way. So here's how hypnotherapy can help with phobias. It's getting rid of that path by different hypnotherapy methods, and it's creating a new path elsewhere where on this new way, the fear and the stress and the strain and the anxiety just doesn't exist. So let me share with you a case history which I've had permission to share to demonstrate this point. Now, many years ago, I also used to do home visits for hypnotherapy clients. This could be for a number of reasons. They either didn't want to travel. I had an office in London at the time, so they didn't want to travel to an office in London, and they preferred, these maybe mobility issues or whatever it might be. So one day I found myself doing a hypnotherapy session on this client who had a hypnotherapy of worms, had a phobia of worms. Now, you're not born with a phobia. A phobia is created, and you may know why you have a phobia if you have one, or you may not know. Doesn't matter, your unconscious will know. Now, this particular client had a phobia of worms, and it had been really bad for her, and it started when she was a young girl. Her very first memory of this was she was in the living room. She suddenly, out of the blue, heard her mother screaming from the kitchen, but she also heard her father, and her father was laughing. So this confused her, and she was maybe 6-7 years of age. So gingerly she went into the kitchen to see what was going on, and her father had been digging in the garden and had found a worm and was chasing mum around the kitchen, dangling this worm between his fingers, and he was laughing as he was doing it. Her mother, meanwhile, was absolutely terrified and was screaming, and this confused this client that I had, because one was laughing, one was screaming, and these are two people who were her mentors. These are her parents, and that was one of the first significant events that led to a phobia of worms. Another thing happened later on, a few years down the line, where her parents had another child, so she now had a younger brother. And one day she was in the garden, and this may gross you out a little bit, she saw her younger brother playing with a worm, and he was licking it. Okay, I don't like the sound of that myself, but it repulsed her. And then another thing happened in the park where she was chased by some boys when she was older still, and she was chased up a tree, and they had a worm, and she was petrified, and she stayed in the tree for hours. After it went dark, the boys had left, and she stayed there for hours just in case. But then she was terrified to come down out of the tree, because if there were any worms in the park where she was, she wouldn't be able to see them. So this was really, really intense, and it was that bad that the client disclosed the house that she'd lived in for 30 years had a beautiful garden, but she'd never been in it. And the reason she'd never been in it was because she knew there was probably worms there. And I said, well, how come your garden, how is it so beautiful if you don't go in it? And she said, I get my husband. She said, I don't even like going to garden centres. And if I do go, I stay in the middle of a path, and the plants are over there, and I just look at them from afar. And if we pick any plants, she said, what I do is I go and look out the back bedroom window, which overlooks the garden, and I'll direct my husband where the plants are to be. Terrifying. She said that it was that bad that she would actually cause someone physical harm if they came near her. This is what she felt she would do. She said, even if my own mother came near me with a worm, I feel as if I would actually assault her because it's so bad. It's terrible for her. So we had one session of hypnotherapy. At the end of the session, the session was in her living room. At the end of the session, she said, what happens now? I said, well, it's done. That's it. And she said, well, how will I know? I said, well, let's go in the garden. She said, okay. Now that was a change already. So she went into the garden and she stood on the patio area. It was like a patio and then a raised bed, and that's where the grass was. So she stood on the patio and she said, okay, well, this is a bit strange just even being on the patio area. She said, I'll stand at the door at most, but I've never actually been on the patio. I said, okay. I said, well, how about, because you look like you want this proven to yourself. I said, I've got complete faith that you've done it, but you look like you need to prove to yourself. I said, how about I go and find a worm, and I'll stay in the garden area, you stay there, and I'll show you the worm and you can see how you are. So she was like, okay. So that was another change, because she was already open to the idea that this was going to be okay. So I went into the garden, I found a stick, and I looked around for a bit. Before long, I found a worm, a little worm. I put it on the end of the stick, and I stayed on the grass, didn't go near her with it, and I held it up and I said, what do you think? And she was looking at it and she said, well, that's not a very big worm though, is it? That was another change. I said, well, it is a small worm. I said, let me see if I can go and find its mum or its dad. So I walked around the garden a bit more, found another worm. This one was bigger. Put that on the end of the stick and stayed at the end of the garden. And she was like, this is bizarre. She said, I'm not frightened at all. I'm not frightened in the slightest. She said, come a bit closer. Okay, so I walked a bit closer, I stayed on the grass, and she must have been about maybe 3 feet from this worm. And she said, this is just weird. She said, I don't understand why I'm not scared. And she said, wait there, wait there. And she ran into the house and she got a mobile phone and she brought it out and she called her husband and put him on loudspeaker. Now he answered the phone and she said, hiya, guess where I am? And he said, I don't know. And she said, I'm in the garden. And straight away the husband said, what's the matter? What's the matter? Because he knew how difficult it was for his wife. And she said, nothing's the matter. I'm in the garden and I'm looking at a worm and I'm not scared anymore. This is the power of hypnotherapy. It's so good. And she'd had this for over, she'd been in the house for 30 years and never been in the garden, but she'd had this since she was a young child. If you've got a phobia, you do not have to continue to live with it. This was one session of hypnotherapy, and this is quite common for phobia work with hypnotherapy. Normally it's one session and that's it. It's gone. I've never had to do actually more than one session of hypnotherapy for phobia work. Some other things that hypnotherapy is good for, that's a series of sessions, but for phobia work it's so quick. So if you've got a phobia, you don't have to endure it, you don't have to put up with it, and you don't have to live with it. If you're interested, the way to contact me will be in the description below. So this is just some of the power of hypnotherapy. As I mentioned before, no one is losing control, no one is dancing like Elvis, no one is quacking like a duck. Alright, I hope this helps. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give me a like, give me a little thumbs up, always nice, and feel free to share it with your friends. This is James. Bye bye.